Traditional buildings are usually steel reinforced concrete, but one of the very rare buildings that's a very tall building that doesn't have that steel reinforcement is the World Trade Center towers. Vincent Dunn has seen twisted, warped, bent, and sagging steel in fires. Steel tries to expand at both ends, and when it can no longer expand, it sags. Robert Baring says that steel frame buildings can collapse as a result of fire. This is true for all types of construction materials, not only steel. And if steel can't be brought down with fire, then I wonder why anybody would ever bother to even put fireproofing into a building. And Richard, I give you that question.
Now Richard Gage gets 2 minutes to respond.
We do indeed put fireproofing into steel buildings because it makes them indestructible in fires. No steel frame high-rise has ever come down due to fires, as you'll see in this slide. We have in New York a 50-story building burned for 6 hours. In Los Angeles, a 62-story building burned over 3.5 hours over 5 floors. In Philadelphia, a 38-story building burned 18 hours over 8 floors. And in Caracas, Venezuela, 17 hours over a total of 26 floors. Did they come down? No. Why? Steel frame buildings steel structure is an incredible heat sink. It absorbs that heat and conducts it away from the source. So even in the case where there's no fireproofing, like in the Cardington tests, which had 2,000-degree fires, they did not fail. Why? Because the steel does indeed conduct this heat throughout the building. Now, my opponent showed you a classic controlled demolition with high-energy explosives like C4 and RDX, which have a loud bang, and they have bright flashes. If you were going to do a deceptive controlled demolition, which is what we're seeing in the Twin Towers in Building 7, you would instead use something that wouldn't tip your hand, something quieter, something like an incendiary, which ignites and fizzles. In the case of Building 7, doesn't provide those bright flashes, but yields a lot more evidence, which we're going to be showing you in just a few minutes. Relative to holes being drilled in preparation, this could be done over a period of months in the World Trade Center high-rises, in which we'll show you how much access they had to, uninterrupted access, unseen by the occupants of the building.
All right, and now we invite our two debaters to talk with each other for 1 minute.
Well, you talked about how conductive steel is and how it conducts heat away. Well, copper is 8 times as conductive as steel, for one thing. And I wanted to ask you about, I think you're theorizing about nanothermites. It's sometimes difficult to know exactly what the theory is, because there's so many different ones out there. My understanding of nanothermites is that it's very explosive. Richard, what do you say to that?
Nanothermite is a very advanced energetic material which can be designed in very sophisticated laboratories, operated only by the most sophisticated U.S. defense contractors, by the way. It can be designed to be as an incendiary, and it goes fizzle, or it can be designed very explosively. We don't know exactly how they were designed, but we do have the evidence that we'll be looking at of them. Why are they found in the World Trade Center dust at all?
And then my last question, again, as an architect, why would you even want to bother putting fireproofing onto steel if it can't collapse in fire?
Well, because steel collapses when it is not fireproof. The ones you cited collapsed only because they were not fireproof. These are low rises.
Time's up, Mr. Gage. All right, we're ready now for our second question, and I remind you that the order for these questions was agreed to by our two debaters in advance, and it again goes to Mr. Chris Mohr, and it involves the near freefall destruction of the towers. Mr. Mohr, the towers are seen to be coming down very fast, as if in free fall. How can this happen without controlled demolition?
Well, thank you. First of all, the towers, I think almost free fall speed is not really accurate. And this says the first exterior panels hit the ground in 9 to 11 seconds. That represents free fall speed. Thomas Iger says that most of the building fell at 2/3 of free fall speed and took about 15 seconds to fall. And then the core with its extra structural supports came down last. And there is some recent photographs with some evidence of that. If you look down about 2/3 of the way down there, you can see evidence that the core itself is right there. It is the last thing to be collapsing. 12 or 28 stories of, depending on which one of them, the core comes down later, so as much as 25 seconds after everything else. And that's because it had more resistance to the downward momentum. If I told you guys I was making almost $100,000 a year, and then you found out that I was making $67,000 a year, you'd think I was exaggerating. Almost free fall speed, or near free fall speed, when we're talking about the towers, is simply not an accurate description of what actually happened. If there were any kind of controlled demolition, then we would find, that things would come down a lot faster. Now, F equals ma is the formula that I think that's very relevant here. And I did a little experiment to show you the power of gravitational acceleration. And basically what I did was I took a scale that is capable of measuring 300 pounds of weight. I put a 25-pound weight onto that scale, and then I picked it up and I dropped it to see what would happen. What would it measure after only 6.5 feet, or half of a story? Well, I destroyed the scale. And so that kind of tells you a little bit of something, that F equals ma, within 1 second, we have 10 times as much force. That 25 pounds, within just over a second, had so much force that it actually destroyed the measuring device itself. So we have to be kind of aware of the power of gravity here. And it's a big one. The World Trade Center buildings, 1 billion pounds, 100 miles an hour, 180 million pounds crashing down onto it.
It's interesting that the scale slowed down the acceleration of the weight. The scale did not pulverize to dust or metal fragments. We'll see in the case of the Twin Towers that it did. Controlled demolitions have very specific characteristics. Let's look at a couple. These 10 characteristics, including the sudden onset of destruction, are all proof of controlled demolition. Sudden onset of destruction at the base of the tower. Straight down, symmetrical collapse into its own footprint. Demolition waves remove the column supports. That's how we get the symmetry. A free fall speed, often, through the path of what was the greatest resistance, resulting in the total dismemberment of the steel structure, broken up and ready for loading and shipment. Minimal damage caused to adjacent structures. Sounds and flashes of explosions, or nearly as loud as explosions in the case of thermite sometimes, which are heard and seen by witnesses. Enormous clouds of pulverized concrete filling the air, squibs or isolated ejections of explosives going off, chemical evidence of cutter charges. We'll see all this in the evidence tonight. It's all direct evidence of explosive destruction, and guess what? Fire can't create any one of these phenomena, let alone all of them. Additional supporting documentation, like experts agree, yeah, it's a controlled demolition. Government documentation often helps us. This is all proof of a controlled demolition, which we're going to see in the case of Building 7 and the North Tower tonight. Regarding the near free fall, the lightest structure is composed at the top. Let's take a look. We're talking about equal and opposite forces here. The bottom structure is not unlike a Mack truck running into the top portion, which is much lighter, less strong. We have an equal and opposite reaction, even if they're not running headlong into each other. Which one's going to be destroyed first? The Mack truck or the Volkswagen? The lower portion or the upper portion?
All right, gentlemen, now you have 1 minute to discuss among yourselves.
So you're actually saying that a 180 million pound building top coming down at over 100 miles an hour is not capable of causing a collapse. That makes no sense to me. I mean, I took a 25-pound weight and messed up my scale with 6.5 feet. I don't understand how you're denying the power of gravity to destroy that building.
Let's take a look. We have, what do we see? Do we see a 180 million pound building coming down at free fall acceleration? No. What we're seeing is the top portion of the building being destroyed itself in 4 seconds. After that, there's nothing crushing the rest of the building. It's coming down at that near free fall acceleration. It's going faster and faster and faster, straight down through the path of greatest resistance, not being slowed down at all. It's going faster and faster. This is acceleration.
It is slowed down to 2/3 of free fall acceleration. Stop exaggerating, number one. And number two, this collapse here, well, I've run out of time, so I'll make that point later.
Well, we have an agreement that even if time runs out, our participants are allowed to finish their sentence. So you are allowed to finish your sentence.
I think I'll drop it for now.
Very good.
Go ahead.
Like Congress, you can't get it back
That's
later.
That's right.
Okay. We're going to go again now to Chris Mohr. And we're going to continue. South Tower destruction. The top of the South Tower actually tilted first when it started to come down. Mr. Mohr, though the damage to each tower was asymmetrical, the towers come straight down rather than topple over. Isn't this evidence of controlled demolition?
Thank you. And first of all, gravity, it brings things straight down. It's very interesting. I know Richard used this, and this was actually very impressive. The way Richard used this in his Blueprint for Truth video. This he sees where the tilting tower starts tipping 22 degrees on the South Tower. And then he says, angular momentum should keep that kind of going. Well, all three of the buildings, in every case, all three of the buildings began their collapses into their weakest points. This is the most dramatic one that has a 22-degree thing where the collapse begins just above the crash point. And Tom Sullivan, again, the controlled demolition guy, says you couldn't have a controlled demolition in a fire zone. So he says that the plane crashes would have to be precisely planned and the demolition starting away from the fires. But these collapses started right inside of the fires. If these explosives were placed, they would have been destroyed and damaged. Explosives burn, detonate, or chemically degrade in high heat. They're very sensitive components. Controlled demolitions could not instantly right a 180 million pound block. That would not be possible. So sometimes you say, well, why didn't it just tip over more? You need some kind of lateral force to do that. You can't just have something tip over unless there's enough force. If there's angular momentum, if there's enough angular momentum, it will tip over all the way. If there's not enough angular momentum, and it did get to 22 degrees, gravity, in this case, trumped it. There wasn't enough angular momentum, and it came back down again. So that explains very simply, and as soon as it started coming down, gravity took care of the rest. Gravity, gravity, gravity. I keep telling you that. The fast descent of the building, many of the engineers and experts that I talked to said that the building would collapse to the ground before it even had time to tip over, even if it did have enough angular momentum. And the crushed structure does resist, and the reactive force tends to keep the upper block straightened back out again. So those are just a few of the things that I wanted to say about that, but I talked to so many people, and almost every single expert that I talked to agrees that this would have ended up coming straight down, that gravity trumps it all.
Richard?
Well, I wish that were true. We have 22 degrees off-center of this massive structure. But what happens? We have the we would expect it to fall in some mangled heap at the bottom. But what does it do? It disintegrates. It defragments into its individual structural components, which, as we'll see, are then hurled in all directions symmetrically outside the footprint. The structure is completely dismembered. And we have at the base, underneath this incredible destruction, like the firemen described, 118 of them who were interviewed in the oral histories, bands of explosions, pop, 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 all the way around the building, traversing in nearly free fall acceleration. Again, faster and faster, not slowing down. There is no deceleration occurring in either twin tower. While they're not at free fall, they are darn near it, but it doesn't slow down. It gets faster and faster. We would expect asymmetry at the base of these towers, given that there was asymmetrical damage from the airplanes, asymmetrical damage from the fires, and asymmetrical loading from this massive heap, this massive top portion that is off-center from below. But what do we see at the base? Complete symmetry of equally distributed, individually cut structural columns. It's an outside the footprint of the building. This is supposed to be a gravitational pancaking collapse. What do we see at the base? Anything but a pile, and we'll be looking for those floors in that pile in a moment.